Picture this scene, unfolding in absolute darkness. The door to your sleeping quarters explodes inward with a crash that tears you from sleep. Before you can even reach for the sword leaning against the stone wall 3 feet away, rough, calloused hands drag you violently from your bed onto the cold floor. You are a French soldier, one of Jacques de Chatillon's garrison stationed in Bruges to enforce French occupation, and the room is suddenly filled with men who smell of iron, raw wool, and murderous intent. These are not knights following codes of chivalry. These are butchers and weavers, armed with axes still wet with blood from the street outside, with cleavers designed for dismembering cattle carcasses. One of them, a giant of a man with shoulders built from years at the loom, grabs you by the hair with one massive hand and yanks your head back, exposing your throat. He places a heavy blade against your neck. You can feel it, cold and sharp. He doesn't demand money or valuables. He doesn't ask for surrender. He screams a single phrase directly into your terrified face, spit flying. Shield on vriend, shield, and friend. It's a simple phrase in Flemish dialect, 2 common words. But your life depends entirely on your ability to pronounce the harsh, guttural consonants correctly. And you are French. You stammer the words desperately, trying to mimic the sounds, but your French tongue, trained from birth to flow smoothly through Romance vowels, stumbles catastrophically over the harsh Germanic sounds. This comes out wrong. The blade moves decisively. The last thing you hear before darkness is the wet gurgle of your own blood, joining the torrent already washing down the cobblestones outside. This brutal, intimate execution, repeated 2,000 times across Bruges in a single night, was the spark that ignited the Battle of the Golden Spurs, a conflict that would see the supposedly invincible knights of France butchered like livestock in Flemish mud. Before we dive into this forgotten story of class warfare and tactical genius, if you're fascinated by the brutal realities behind sanitized medieval history, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles for more content exposing these truths. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient massacres together from different parts of the world, connected across 7 centuries by our shared need to understand how the powerless sometimes destroy the powerful. To understand why shopkeepers and craftsmen were systematically slaughtering professional soldiers at dawn on the 18th of May, 1302, we must strip away the romantic varnish Hollywood paints over the Middle Ages. Forget the chivalrous tournaments and courtly love poetry. The brutal reality of Flanders in the early 14th century was a protection racket built on systematic extortion and military dominance. King Philip IV of France, ironically nicknamed Philip the Fair for his handsome features, viewed the wealthy textile cities of Flanders, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres not as subjects to be governed justly, but as vaults to be systematically looted. He needed enormous quantities of gold to fund his endless wars of expansion, his conflicts with the papacy, his administrative ambitions, and the textile cities, grown obscenely rich from wool trade with England, were practically overflowing with wealth. Philip didn't just tax these cities through normal feudal obligations. He occupied them with military force. He sent Jacques de Chatillon, a governor who ruled with the diplomatic subtlety of a sledgehammer, to bring the independent-minded Flemish burghers to absolute heel. Chatillon's method was designed for maximum humiliation. He garrisoned French troops directly in private homes throughout Bruges. Imagine the daily degradation, the constant violation. Foreign soldiers eating your food, sleeping under your roof, harassing your wife and daughters, drinking your wine, taking whatever they wanted, all backed by the full military might of the French crown. You couldn't complain. You couldn't resist. The message was brutally clear. You are not citizens with rights. You are property to be exploited. But Philip the Fair and his arrogant governor Chatillon made a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost thousands of lives. They mistook the absence of noble titles for the absence of courage, intelligence, and organizational capacity. They assumed that because these Flemish men worked with their hands daily, dyeing expensive wool in chemical vats, tanning leather until it was supple, forging iron in roaring furnaces, they would not know how to organize violence, how to plan coordinated action, how to fight effectively. They were spectacularly, fatally wrong. On that fateful May morning, known to history as the Matins of Bruges, the city didn't just riot spontaneously. It executed a meticulously planned military purge with professional precision. Pieter de Koninck, a master weaver known for his inflammatory speeches, small in physical stature but possessing a tongue of political fire, had spent weeks organizing the craft guilds into coordinated death squads. Each guild knew its assignment, its target zones, its specific objectives. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness with terrifying efficiency and coordination. The target was brutally simple. Every single Frenchman in the city, soldier or civilian, sympathizer or occupier. The shield on Vreen, shibboleth the linguistic password, was a masterstroke of urban ethnic warfare that reveals deep planning. In the chaotic darkness before dawn, in houses and streets where visibility was nearly zero, uniforms and armor meant nothing for identification. Flemish rebels looked identical to Flemish collaborators who supported French rule. The only reliable way to instantly identify friend from enemy was linguistic. The tongue cannot lie about its native training. The Flemish dialect requires a specific, harsh contortion of the throat and precise placement of consonants that a native French speaker, no matter how intelligent or motivated, simply cannot mimic without years of practice. The sh sound in shield was particularly diagnostic. French has no equivalent sound. It was a perfect biological death trap. Those who could pronounce it lived. Those who couldn't died immediately. As the sun rose over Bruges that May morning, painting the canals red, the bodies of approximately 2,000 French soldiers, administrators, tax collectors, and Francophile Flemish collaborators choked the waterways. They were dragged from cellars where they'd hidden, pulled from churches where they'd sought sanctuary violating sacred customs, and butchered in the open streets. Chatillon himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing in borrowed civilian clothing while his entire garrison was systematically erased from existence. This was not a spontaneous riot or a battle. This was an organized message written in French blood, sent directly to Paris with absolute clarity. We will not submit. When the shocking news reached the French royal court, carried by traumatized survivors, the reaction was seismic and immediate. The peasantry, the commons, the Third Estate had not just disobeyed royal authority or refused taxation. They had massacred the king's anointed representatives, killed noblemen. To the French aristocracy, this was an inversion of the natural order so grotesque it defied comprehension, as incomprehensible as sheep organizing to eat wolves. The elaborate code of chivalry that governed medieval warfare dictated absolutely that war was the exclusive sport of noble gentlemen, played by specific civilized rules. Knights fought knights. Commoners obeyed or died. The Flemish had just flipped the entire board, violated every rule, and suggested that perhaps the game itself was rigged. Philip the Fair's reaction was immediate, apocalyptic, and designed to restore natural order through overwhelming violence. He did not summon a diplomat to negotiate terms or a lawyer to argue legal jurisdiction. He summoned Robert of Artois, and that choice tells you everything about his intentions. Robert was the quintessential French knight in every particular. Physically brave to the point of recklessness, martially aggressive, supremely confident in his nobility's inherent superiority, and completely blinded by his own class prejudices. To Robert, the Flemish burghers were a mob of rabbits, soft, cowardly, weak, that simply needed to be hunted down and slaughtered to restore proper order. He assembled a punitive military force designed specifically to crush the rebellion with overwhelming shock and awe, to make an example so terrifying that no commoner would dare look a knight directly in the eye for the next century. We are talking about the absolute crème de la crème of European military technology. 2,500 noble knights and mounted squires, the largest concentration of heavy cavalry in Western Europe, supported by thousands of professional Genoese crossbowmen and regular infantry. These knights rode destriers, massive war horses bred over generations specifically for battlefield impact, each costing more than a village earned in years. They wore the finest chainmail hauberks, often reinforced with early plates of expensive steel protecting vital areas. This was walking wealth, mobile fortresses. The stated objective was not merely to retake Bruges and restore French authority. The real goal was to inflict punishment so severe, so memorable, so utterly crushing that no commoner anywhere in Europe would dare consider rebellion for generations. Robert marched his glittering army north from Paris, deliberately burning villages as he advanced, driving terrified refugees before his forces, like cattle before wolves, demonstrating French power. The Flemish, watching the smoke rise on the horizon, faced an impossible mathematical calculation. They had enraged the greatest military superpower in Western Europe. They had no cavalry of their own to match the French shock troops, no king to legitimize their cause, no castles to hide behind and wait out a siege. Military retreat meant eventual execution when caught. Political surrender meant slavery, or worse. So this army of weavers, butchers, dyers, and craftsmen did something that seemed like collective insanity. They grabbed their pikes, their wooden clubs, and their goedendags, a weapon we'll examine shortly, and marched deliberately toward the town of Courtrai to meet the French in open battle. They studied the geography carefully, the river Lys, the marshy brooks, the deceptively green fields. They realized with cold clarity that if they couldn't beat the French knights in a fair fight, and they absolutely couldn't, they would have to force the aristocrats into a fundamentally unfair fight, where French advantages became liabilities. Robert of Artois was coming to trample them into the mud with overwhelming force, but the weavers and butchers of Flanders, dismissed as rabbits, were busy preparing the most perfect kill box in medieval military history. The stage was set for a clash that would shatter the spine of French nobility and prove that class was not destiny. 200 miles south of the Bruges massacre, in the magnificent royal court of Paris, the atmosphere was not one of fear or even concern. It was one of icy, murderous, aristocratic indignation mixed with absolute confidence. King Philip IV sat at the center of a vast web of political and military power stretching across Christendom. Contemporary chroniclers called him the Fair for his handsome, almost feminine features, but whispered that he was more marble statue than living man unblinking, silent in council, utterly ruthless in execution. To a monarch who genuinely believed his authority flowed directly from God's will, the Bruges massacre was not a military setback requiring tactical adjustment. It was theological blasphemy requiring divine punishment. Philip the Fair did not rage or shout. He calculated with cold precision. The Flemish burghers had shattered the fundamental social contract that held medieval civilization together. In the rigid medieval worldview, taught by every priest and accepted as natural law, God had ordained three distinct estates. The nobility existed to fight and rule through inherited martial excellence. The clergy existed to pray and mediate between God and man, and the peasantry existed to work the land and obey their betters. This was not social convention, this was divine mandate. By raising their calloused hands against anointed knights, the weavers of Bruges had threatened the very foundation of civilized order. If a fuller, a cloth worker who cleaned wool in urine, could kill a count and survive unpunished, then the crowns of every monarch in Europe would sit dangerously loose on worried heads. The king's calculated response was to unleash the full crushing weight of the French state apparatus. He authorized the formal call to feudal arms, summoning the levy. From the sun-drenched vineyards of Burgundy to the Norman plains, from Champagne to Picardy, royal messengers rode out carrying parchments sealed with Philip's distinctive seal. The command was simple and absolute: assemble for war. What gathered slowly under the banner of the golden fleur-de-lis over subsequent weeks was the terrifying apex of medieval military technology and aristocratic power. We often imagine medieval armies as disorganized mobs of peasants with pitchforks, but the force Philip methodically assembled was a precision instrument of organized violence, representing centuries of tactical evolution. At its armored heart rode the French heavy cavalry, the knights. We must understand what a fully equipped knight represented in 1302. To grasp the scale of the coming upset, this was not merely a well-trained soldier or a professional warrior. He was a human tank, a mobile fortress, the ultimate weapon system of his age. A fully armored knight, mounted on a destrier warhorse, was virtually unstoppable by any weapon available to common infantry. The horse alone cost the equivalent of a peasant family's lifetime accumulated wages. A massive beast, bred over generations for size, aggression, and the capacity to carry enormous weight. These animals were trained from birth to charge into screaming chaos without flinching, to trample men underfoot without hesitation, to bite and kick enemies. The rider was encased in layered mail, hauberks reinforced increasingly with early plate armor, protecting joints and vital organs, creating a fortress of steel that made him functionally invulnerable to the primitive weapons available to lower classes. When 2,500 of these armored riders charged forward in coordinated unison, their lances lowered, they generated kinetic energy that could shatter even disciplined infantry formations through sheer physical impact and psychological terror. For 3 continuous centuries, they had been the undisputed masters of European battlefields, the ultimate argument enders. Commanding this punitive expedition was Robert of Artois, and his selection reveals Philip's intentions. If Philip represented the cold, calculating intellect of French power, Robert was its fiery, righteous sword. A prince of royal blood and a seasoned combat veteran with decades of experience, Robert was the living physical embodiment of chivalric ideals. He was demonstrably brave in battle, physically imposing, martially skilled, and spectacularly, fatally arrogant about his class's inherent superiority. He viewed the upcoming campaign not as a war between roughly equal forces requiring careful strategy, but as a simple disciplinary action against rebellious inferiors. In his aristocratic mind, shaped by a lifetime of unchallenged privilege, he wasn't marching north to fight an actual army. He was marching to publicly whip rebellious dogs back into submission. Robert's contemptuous attitude toward the enemy trickled down through the aristocratic ranks like poison. As the massive French host began its deliberate march north toward Flanders, a carnival atmosphere prevailed among the nobility. The knights packed their finest silk tunics and velvet cloaks alongside their combat swords, expecting victory celebrations. They brought their prized hunting falcons and expensive hounds, planning post-battle entertainment. They wagered gold coins on who would personally kill the most Flemish rabbits. They fully expected the dirty shopkeepers to scatter in terror at the first glimpse of a royal banner flying. The idea that a militia of weavers and butchers could actually stand against the flower of French nobility in open combat was not just unlikely, it was a mathematical impossibility in their worldview, a violation of natural law. But Robert of Artois made certain the march itself became psychological warfare and collective punishment. As the French army crossed from royal territory into rebellious Flanders, they initiated a deliberate scorched earth policy designed to break civilian morale. They didn't just forage for necessary food supplies, they burned what they couldn't physically carry. Entire villages were put to the torch for no strategic reason. Crops were systematically trampled under thousands of hooves. Anyone found on the roads, civilian or otherwise, was casually put to the sword. Robert wanted the thick smoke of burning farmhouses to be visible for miles from Bruges' walls. He wanted them to smell their approaching doom on the wind. This calculated terror was designed to induce panic and fracture the coalition. Robert confidently expected the wealthy merchant oligarchs of Ghent to sell out the radical revolutionaries of Bruges to save their own commercial interests and properties. He anticipated that begging delegations would come crawling out of city gates with keys and hostages, pleading desperately for mercy and offering total submission. He misjudged his enemy completely, catastrophically. Instead of fracturing under pressure, the terror forged the competing Flemish cities into a singular block of hardened resolve. The smoke rising on every horizon didn't make them want to surrender. It proved beyond argument that they had absolutely nothing left to lose except their lives. The rabbits did not scatter into holes. They converged into a unified formation. As the French army approached the town of Courtrai in early July, Robert surveyed the upcoming battlefield with deep satisfaction. He commanded roughly 2,500 elite noble cavalry and perhaps 5,500 supporting infantry, including unmatched Genoese crossbowmen, the finest missile troops available. He observed the Flemish defensive positions and actually scoffed out loud. They were lined up on foot, without horses, an obvious admission of poverty and low status in his aristocratic eyes. However, Robert's supreme confidence blinded him completely to the increasingly urgent warnings of his own experienced scouts. The terrain around Courtrai was an absolute nightmare for heavy cavalry operations. The area was crisscrossed by the River Lys and an extensive network of brooks, streams, and agricultural drainage ditches. The ground was perpetually soft, sodden with the river's seasonal overflow and poor drainage. For heavy horses dependent on firm footing to deliver their characteristic devastating charge, this was treacherous, dangerous ground. Robert's more experienced tactical advisors suggested strongly a more cautious approach. They urged him to deploy his superior Genoese crossbowmen, first to whittle the Flemish down safely from range, or simply to starve them out through siege. They asked reasonable questions. Why risk irreplaceable noble blood against replaceable peasants? Why charge into uncertain terrain? Robert dismissed every cautious voice with an aristocratic sneer that would doom thousands. To wait would be cowardly, unbefitting French honor. To rely primarily on hired crossbowmen would deny the knights their rightful glory and the personal combat that justified their existence. He wanted to crush the rebels with a traditional cavalry charge, to hear the satisfying sound of breaking Flemish bones under French hooves. He reportedly remarked dismissively that if these shopkeeper rabbits were foolish enough to stand and fight, he would run them down so fast the wind wouldn't have time to dry the mud splattered on their terrorized faces. The French camp settled in for the night before battle. Squires polished armor until it gleamed like mirrors in the firelight. Knights carefully sharpened their lance points and checked the edges on their swords. They wagered on kill counts. They checked and rechecked the straps on their saddles and the iron shoes on their precious horses. They slept soundly that night, utterly secure in their class superiority, completely unaware that across the darkened field, thousands of desperate men were awake, sharpening iron pike points and praying to God for the strength to hold their line against the coming storm. The Lily of France had arrived, beautiful and deadly and supremely confident, but the treacherous mud of Flanders was waiting patiently to swallow it whole. Across the muddy expanse of the disputed field, the view from the elevated French positions was one of pure aristocratic contempt, mixed with anticipation. The knights saw a dark, shapeless mass of common humanity huddled defensively against the river's edge. They observed men in dirty, undyed wool tunics, completely lacking the brilliant heraldic colors and symbols that marked true aristocracy. To the French nobility, their entire worldview confirmed by birth, this was obviously a mob of terrified serfs, a rabble of angry peasants clutching farming tools and sticks, waiting passively to be dispersed like chaff. This was the most dangerous and consequential optical illusion in military history. The force waiting grimly in the mud was not a peasant uprising at all. It was the Flemish urban militia, and it represented something entirely revolutionary in medieval warfare: the deliberate weaponization of the urban middle class. To understand why this particular army would not break and run when the charge came, you must understand the fundamental nature of medieval guild organization. In 1302 Flanders, a craft guild was far more than a simple trade union bargaining for wages. It was effectively a state within a state, a complete social structure. If you were a master weaver in Bruges, the Guild of Weavers was your entire world from birth to death. They set your wages through collective bargaining. They rigorously inspected the quality of every cloth you produced. They provided for your widow and orphaned children if you died young. They buried your body in consecrated ground when you passed. They were simultaneously your government, your insurance policy, your extended family, and your identity. Now, facing existential threat, they were your military platoon, and the bonds were unbreakable. The men, standing shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall, were not strangers conscripted randomly from different villages who'd never met. They were literal co-workers who had labored side by side for decades. The man standing on your immediate right was the same man who sat next to you at the loom every single day for the past 10 years. The man on your left was your actual neighbor. You knew his wife's name. You knew his children's faces. You'd shared meals in his home. You knew with absolute certainty he wouldn't run and abandon the line, because if he did, he wouldn't just be deserting some abstract army. He would be betraying his brothers, his guild, his entire identity and life. This created a level of organic unit cohesion and mutual trust that the French knights, for all their superior individual martial prowess, could never hope to match. The French fought primarily for personal glory and potential ransom profits. The Flemish fought for the man standing next to them and for their city's survival. Examine their equipment closely. You won't find the custom-fitted plate armor of hereditary nobility. Instead, you see the industrial strength and standardization of the wealthy city. These urban craftsmen were rich enough to arm themselves properly with quality equipment. They wore heavy steel helmets called kettle hats that protected effectively against downward sword strokes. They wore thick padded jackets called gambesons, multiple layers of quilted linen capable of absorbing the blunt force trauma of maces and hammers. Many wore chainmail hauberks purchased collectively through guild funds. They carried long pikes, powerful crossbows, heavy axes, and the distinctive goedendag. This was mass-produced, utilitarian military gear. It wasn't aesthetically beautiful or individually customized, but it was brutally effective and standardized for coordinated use. The leadership structure was equally radical and unprecedented. While the French army was commanded by counts and dukes who inherited their authority purely through aristocratic bloodline, regardless of ability, the Flemish were led by elected demagogues who had risen through demonstrated competence and popular support. Men like Pieter de Koninck, a master weaver, small in physical stature, blind in one eye from a weaving accident, but possessing a tongue of political fire that could move crowds to action. He was a genuine populist leader who had rallied the working poor against both the French king and the wealthy Flemish patrician oligarchs who wanted to capitulate for profit. Beside him stood Jan Bredel, the powerful leader of the Butchers' Guild, a man whose daily profession involved efficiently dismembering large animal carcasses, and who brought that specific anatomical skill set directly to the battlefield. These guild leaders did not sit safely on horses behind the lines directing traffic. They stood in the dangerous front rank, shoulder to shoulder with their apprentices and journeymen, sharing the risk equally. The atmosphere in the Flemish camp the night before battle was starkly, dramatically different from the carnival atmosphere across the field. There was no gambling on outcomes. There was no wine flowing freely. There was no celebration. There was only a terrifying clarity of purpose born from desperation. Every man in that camp knew the brutal rules of medieval engagement. In a typical battle between professional armies, if a knight was captured alive, he would be held for ransom. It was a civilized financial transaction. Nobility had monetary value, but for a rebellious commoner who had killed anointed nobles, there was no ransom possibility. There was only the hangman's rope or the executioner's axe. The Flemish knew they were fighting with their backs, literally to the wall. They had deliberately positioned themselves with the River Lys directly behind their formation. This was not tactical error, but calculated psychological warfare against themselves. It sent an unmistakable message to every man in the ranks. There is no retreat possible. You cannot run from this fight because you will drown in the river. We win here on this ground, or we die here together. This army of urban guildsmen was a complex, sophisticated organism despite appearances. The weavers, disciplined from years of repetitive precision work, formed the solid heavy infantry blocks. The crossbowmen recruited from smaller trades provided essential ranged support. The butchers, with their heavy cleavers and intimate knowledge of anatomy, acted as mobile shock troops. They moved in disciplined silence, responding instantly to commands from their guild deans. The French saw a chaotic rabble. The reality was a disciplined, desperate machine, fueled by class hatred and existential dread. But discipline and motivation alone cannot stop a cavalry charge any more than prayer stops an avalanche. To actually kill an armored knight, you need more than brotherhood and courage. You need a tool specifically designed to negate the overwhelming advantages of armor and horsepower. The Flemish had developed such a tool through practical experimentation. It was a weapon so crude in appearance, so brutal in application, and so devastatingly effective in practice that it would become the iconic symbol of the battle. It was a heavy wooden club with a steel spike, and the soldiers gave it a darkly humorous name. They called it the goedendag. If you visit a military museum in Flanders today, you might encounter a weapon that looks deceptively simple, almost primitive. It resembles a heavy walking staff, approximately 5 feet long, thickening substantially at the top like a baseball bat, with a sharp steel spike protruding from the center of the weighted end. It completely lacks the elegant curves of a sword or the impressive length of a cavalry lance. It looks like a crude tool a farmer might use to break up frozen clods of earth or drive stakes. This unpretentious object is the goedendag, and on the 11th of July, 1302, it was the most terrifying object in the known world for any French knight. The name itself is a grim historical joke that has survived 7 centuries. Goedendag translates directly from Flemish Dutch as good day, a cheerful greeting. Some academic historians argue the name derives from goedendags, meaning good dagger, but oral tradition and folk memory suggest a darker, more sardonic origin. That Flemish militiamen would greet their French oppressors with a cheerful good day right before crushing their aristocratic skulls. To understand why this simple wooden stick was an effective night killer, we must examine the physics of medieval armor systems. By 1302, French knights wore mail hauberks, thousands of interlocking iron rings, often reinforced with early experimental plates of hardened steel, protecting knees, shins, elbows, and chest. A sword slash against this sophisticated defense system is functionally useless. The blade simply glances off without penetrating. An arrow needs to hit a precise weak point, like the narrow eye slit in the helmet or the vulnerable armpit, to cause real damage. The goedendag solved this frustrating problem by completely ignoring finesse and technical skill, instead maximizing pure physics and kinetic energy transfer. It was a dual-threat weapon system designed specifically for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. First, the spike function. When a massed cavalry charge comes thundering toward your position, the goedendag user plants the wooden base firmly into the mud for stability and aims the sharp steel point directly at the charging horse's chest or face. The animal's own forward momentum does the killing work. The horse impales itself on the spike, its own weight and speed driving the point deep into vital organs. The beast collapses immediately, its charge momentum converted into a tumbling, screaming obstacle that dumps the armored rider violently onto the ground and blocks the horses behind. But the true genius of the goedendag's design reveals itself after the knight hits the ground. A knight lying in mud is still functionally a tank you cannot easily stab through his chest plate with normal weapons. But the goedendag is deliberately top-heavy, constructed from dense, seasoned oak bound with iron reinforcement rings. It functions as a massive two-handed war club, generating immense kinetic energy when swung in a full arc. When you swing it with both hands, using your full body weight, you generate tremendous crushing force. You don't need to penetrate the armor's surface. You simply need to transfer the massive shockwave through the steel shell into the soft human body inside. A solid overhead strike to a helmet with a goedendag doesn't need to cut or dent the metal. The concussive force travels through the helmet structure directly into the skull, causing immediate traumatic brain hemorrhaging, severe concussions, or catastrophic neck fractures from whiplash. It effectively turns the knight's own protective armor into an echo chamber that amplifies the trauma. The Flemish had developed a sophisticated tactical doctrine around this elegant weapon through years of experimentation. They didn't simply give everyone a club and tell them to swing wildly. They paired the goedendag wielders systematically with long pikemen in a coordinated two-rank system. The front rank held pikes 12 to 15 feet of ashwood, tipped with steel, creating a bristling wall of points to halt and disrupt the horses. The goedendag men stood in the second rank, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The tactical sequence was brutal, efficient, and rhythmic like a machine. The front rank pike stops or kills the horse. The second rank goedendag hooks the falling rider or smashes the horse's legs to bring it down. Once the knight is sprawling in the mud, the militia swarms him like ants. This required nerves of absolute steel. Standing in formation directly in front of a charging destrier warhorse requires complete suppression of every survival instinct evolution has built into the human brain. But remember the guild bonds. These men trusted each other completely based on decades of shared work. The pikeman knew with certainty that if he held his terrifying position, his brother standing behind him with the club would finish the job. They had practiced this. The French had no conceptual framework for this kind of coordinated infantry tactic. In their entire military worldview, infantry existed exclusively to be trampled by superior cavalry. They had never encountered a weapon system designed so specifically to dismantle their technological and tactical advantages. They looked at the goedendag and saw a primitive peasant's stick, crude and beneath notice. They completely failed to see that it was actually an armor-piercing kinetic sledgehammer optimized for their destruction. Furthermore, the goedendag was remarkably cheap to mass-produce. A quality sword took a master smith weeks of skilled labor to forge properly and cost a small fortune. A functional goedendag could be mass-produced by any village carpenter and blacksmith working together in a single day using common materials. It represented the democratization of lethal violence. For the price of one French warhorse, you could equip 100 common men with effective tools to kill the rider. As the sun climbed higher over the contested field of Courtrai on that fateful July morning, the Flemish militia tightened their calloused grips on these oak shafts. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a bristling porcupine of pikes and clubs, waiting grimly for the ground to begin shaking. They had the will to fight. They had the weapon to kill. Now they just needed the terrain itself to cooperate and turn traitor against the French. because even the bravest man with the biggest club cannot stop a full cavalry charge on flat, open ground. The Flemish desperately needed an equalizer. They needed the land itself to become their secret ally, and that is exactly what they engineered with shovels and sweat. In military strategic theory, there is an ancient maxim: amateur soldiers talk endlessly about tactics. Professional soldiers talk about logistics and supply. But there exists a third tier. True geniuses talk about geography and terrain. If you examine a modern satellite map of Courtrai, known locally as Kortrijk, you see a bustling, prosperous Belgian city. But if you strip away the modern pavement and buildings, returning mentally to July 1302, you see a landscape that was practically designed by malicious nature, specifically to kill horses. The Flemish commanders, including the sharp-eyed tactician Rainier of Richelieu, looked at the available battlefield and saw a complex three-dimensional puzzle. They faced a massive tactical problem: any significant expanse of open field. If they met the French on flat, grassy plains, the knights would simply use their mobility to flank the formation, encircle them completely, and systematically cut them to pieces from all sides. They needed to funnel the French into a narrow corridor where superior numbers and cavalry speed meant absolutely nothing. They chose a defensive position that seemed, to any observer trained in conventional military doctrine, like complete suicide. The Flemish army deployed in a rough crescent shape. Behind their backs roared the River Lys, wide and deep and deadly. This was a blatant violation of basic military doctrine taught to every commander. You never, ever position your army with an uncrossable river at your back, because it eliminates any avenue for tactical retreat. But this was calculated madness, strategic brilliance disguised as error. By deliberately cutting off their own escape route, the Flemish commanders were invoking what ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu called death ground. When soldiers know absolutely that there is no boat coming, no bridge to cross, that retreat means certain drowning, they fight with the supernatural ferocity of trapped animals. It transformed paralyzing fear into rocket fuel. But the real trap, the true genius, lay in front of their defensive position. The battlefield was naturally dissected by the Goedendags stream and an extensive network of smaller muddy runoffs used for agricultural drainage. To a man walking unburdened, these were merely annoying ditches requiring a careful step. To a horse carrying 300 pounds of armored knight at full gallop, they were leg-breaking death traps. The Flemish didn't just passively rely on existing natural streams, they actively enhanced them through engineering. They grabbed shovels and dug systematically for days. They widened existing ditches to make them uncrossable at speed. According to some accounts, they covered these enlarged pits with brush and loose dirt, creating primitive camouflaged booby traps. They deliberately flooded sections of the meadow to transform firm soil into sucking quagmire. They systematically turned the battlefield into a sponge designed to swallow cavalry. Consider the physics of a successful cavalry charge again. A charge relies absolutely on rhythmic coordination. The horses must gallop in perfect unison to create that devastating wall of impact. The ground must be consistently firm to allow for powerful push-off and acceleration. By transforming the field into a muddy obstacle course, the Flemish ensured that the French line would be broken and disrupted before they even made physical contact with the Flemish formation. A knight whose horse stumbles is no longer a fearsome warrior. He is a pile of expensive scrap metal, struggling helplessly to stand up. This was terrain modification tactics at its absolute finest, a masterpiece of military engineering. The Flemish successfully turned the topography itself into a silent ally. They forced the French to attack across a narrow front, creating an artificial bottleneck. This completely negated the French numerical advantage in cavalry. It didn't matter if Robert commanded 2,500 elite knights. if only 50 could physically reach the front line at any given time due to terrain constraints. From the elevated French vantage point, however, these subtle but crucial modifications were functionally invisible. They looked across the field and saw what appeared to be a flat expanse of pleasant green meadow leading up to the Flemish defensive lines. They didn't bother to send scouts to test the ground carefully. They didn't dispatch light cavalry to probe the depth of ditches. Why would they waste time? They were the French, masters of Europe. The ground itself was expected to submit to their will just as the peasants were. Robert of Artois observed the river behind the Flemish position and actually laughed out loud. He thought with satisfaction that they had trapped themselves for his convenience, done half his work. "Look," he might have told his amused lieutenants, "these stupid rabbits have dug their own grave." He was half right. It was indeed a grave. He just didn't realize yet whose bodies would fill it. The morning of July 11 dawned hot and humid, oppressive. Heavy mist rose off the marshes and river, obscuring the deadly modifications the Flemish had made to the landscape under cover of darkness and fog. The trap was set with professional precision. The kill box was ready and waiting. All that remained was for the mouse to be arrogant enough to snap at the baited cheese, and Robert of Artois was absolutely starving for glory and validation. War is usually decided not by who fights best, but by who makes the fewest catastrophic mistakes. On the 11th of July, 1302, the French didn't just make a tactical mistake. They committed a strategic sin, born of pure aristocratic ego that military historians still study. The tragedy for the French army is that they actually started the battle correctly, following sound combined arms doctrine. Robert of Artois, despite his character flaws and arrogance, knew the fundamentals of how to properly deploy his combined arms force. At noon, he ordered his professional infantry and hired mercenaries forward in the traditional manner. These weren't random foot soldiers, they were elite Genoese crossbowmen, the precision snipers of the medieval world, professionals who had spent lifetimes perfecting their craft. These Italian mercenaries carried heavy windlass crossbows, capable of punching completely through mail armor from 100 yards away. They advanced in good order toward the Flemish lines and opened disciplined fire. The air filled with the characteristic thrumming of bowstrings and the deadly hiss of iron bolts. The Flemish, standing in their tight defensive formations, had nowhere to hide from the aerial bombardment. They took steady casualties. Gaps appeared in the previously solid shield wall. Bodies fell. The psychological strain of standing completely still while death literally rains down on you from the sky is immense, almost unbearable. The Flemish line visibly shuddered, on the edge of breaking. If Robert of Artois had simply sat patiently on his horse and waited, allowing the professional crossbowmen to do their work methodically, they might well have won the battle for him without noble blood being spilled. They were systematically softening the enemy up, breaking their cohesion and morale, preparing them psychologically for a rout. But to the French nobility watching impatiently from the rear, this slow, methodical approach was absolutely intolerable and insulting. You must understand the deeply ingrained mindset of a 14th century knight, shaped by decades of cultural conditioning. They did not view warfare as a pragmatic exercise in securing military objectives efficiently. They viewed it as theater for demonstrating personal valor, a stage for proving aristocratic superiority. To allow paid mercenaries, foreigners, and commoners, no less to win the battle using cowardly ranged weapons, was a profound insult to knightly honor and identity. If the Flemish broke and ran away before the knights could charge and engage them personally in glorious combat, there would be no honor gained. There would be no one to physically trample. There would be no heroic stories to tell at court to impress ladies. There would be no glory whatsoever. Dangerous restlessness rippled through the massed cavalry lines like an infectious virus. Expensive horses stomped impatiently in the oppressive heat. Knights cursed the slow, boring, methodical pace of the crossbowmen. They looked at the dirty peasants across the field and saw easy prey being stolen from them by hired help. The peer pressure on Robert of Artois became absolutely unbearable from all sides. His fellow nobles and lieutenants urged him aggressively to attack immediately. "Sir," they likely argued with increasing urgency, "if we wait any longer, these rabbits will flee back to their burrows and we'll have ridden all this way for nothing." So Robert made the single decision that would doom his entire army. He didn't just order a cavalry charge, he ordered it through and over his own supporting troops. He signaled the recall to the crossbowmen. The Genoese professionals, confused and likely frustrated at being pulled back just as their tactics were working, stopped firing and began to methodically reload and withdraw from the field. But they couldn't move fast enough to satisfy the impatient mounted nobles behind them. With a thunderous roar of Montjoie Saint-Denis, the ancient battle cry of France, the heavy cavalry began to move forward at increasing speed. They didn't wait for the professional infantry to fully clear the contested field. They rode them down deliberately, trampling their own hired crossbowmen in their overwhelming eagerness to reach the Flemish. Imagine the absolute chaos. The Genoese are screaming warnings, diving desperately into the mud to avoid being crushed by the iron-shod hooves of their own employers. The careful formation of the charge is already disrupted and degraded before they have even crossed the battlefield's midpoint. The rhythmic, terrifying wall of coordinated horseflesh that is supposed to act as an unstoppable shockwave is now a disorganized stampede, stumbling over allied bodies and abandoned equipment. Across the field, the Flemish commanders must have watched this catastrophic display with genuine disbelief mixed with savage joy. They saw the French carelessly discard their significant tactical advantage. They saw the arrows stop falling, giving them relief. They saw the knights voluntarily disrupting their own formations and killing their own men. It was a gift. The rabbits tightened their grips on their pikes with renewed determination. The goedendags men planted their feet more firmly in the soft earth. The French were coming exactly as the Flemish had desperately hoped. They were coming fast, angry, blind with bloodlust, and completely blind to the engineered mud trap that awaited them. Robert of Artois lowered his personal lance with supreme confidence. He saw only the hated enemy ahead. He did not see the concealed brooks. He did not see the engineered marsh. He definitely did not see the end of the entire age of chivalry rushing up to meet him at full speed. The trap was sprung. The ground began to tremble. If you have never stood directly in front of a massed heavy cavalry charge, it is genuinely difficult to comprehend the sheer acoustic violence and terror of it. 2,500 war horses, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, galloping forward in rage creates a low frequency that you feel vibrating in your teeth before you consciously hear it with your ears. It sounds like an earthquake, like a landslide, like the literal end of the world approaching. To the Flemish militiamen standing by the river, gripping their weapons, the horizon became a wall of gleaming steel, colorful silk banners, and snorting beasts. The French knights lowered their lances in perfect unison, aiming the steel points at the chests of the common peasants. They accelerated to top speed, expecting the militia to break in psychological terror before actual impact. This was the primary weapon of the charge panic, usually killed infantry long before the lances ever made contact. But the Flemish did not break or run. They locked their shields together. They grounded their long pikes firmly in the mud, angling the steel points upward at a precise 45-degree angle. They held their collective breath. Then the geography itself woke up and joined the battle. As the French front line hit absolute top speed, they didn't collide with the Flemish formation. They collided catastrophically with the widened graining stream. In the overwhelming heat and chaos of the charge, obscured by the trampled corpses of their own infantry and the tall summer grass, the knights didn't see the enlarged ditches until it was far too late to stop. The entire front rank plunged directly in. There was no graceful leap or heroic jump. Horses shattered their legs on the uneven, muddy banks. Riders were catapulted violently from their saddles, flying through the air like armored dolls before splashing hard into the muck and water. The fundamental laws of physics are completely indifferent to noble titles and aristocratic pretensions. A successful cavalry charge depends absolutely on flow and momentum. The ditch stopped the flow instantly and completely. But the knights charging behind couldn't possibly know what was happening ahead. They couldn't stop their momentum. They slammed at full speed into the rear of the fallen horses, creating a horrific, chaotic metallic pileup on a massive scale. It was a medieval traffic accident involving thousands of pounds of horse and steel. The shock value of shock cavalry evaporated in seconds. The momentum that was their greatest strategic asset suddenly became their cage, their tomb. The majestic French charge turned instantly into a screaming, churning mass of horseflesh and steel, trapped in a ditch that was rapidly filling with water, mud, and blood. For the knights who somehow managed to stay mounted and physically bridge the ditch, a second nightmare awaited them. They spurred their terrified horses up the muddy bank, only to find themselves nose to nose with a solid wall of 12-foot pikes. A horse, no matter how well trained for war, will rarely voluntarily impale itself on visible spikes. The animals shied away instinctively, reared up in terror, or stopped dead in their tracks, sliding dangerously in the slick mud. The knights were now stationary targets. A stationary knight is just a man sitting on a high chair wearing a metal suit. He has no reach advantage against a 12-foot pike. He has no agility against coordinated men on solid ground. This was the precise moment when medieval warfare fundamentally flipped. The hunters became the hunted. The trappers became the trapped. The Flemish commanders blew their horns, giving the prearranged signal. The order transmitted down the line was not to retreat defensively, but to advance aggressively. The militia bloc took one disciplined step forward, then another. They began to systematically compress the French against the ditch like a vice closing. The goedendags men stepped through the carefully maintained gaps in the pike wall. This is where the true horror began for the French nobility. The French knights were packed so tightly together by the terrain that they couldn't effectively swing their swords. Their horses were belly deep in sucking mud. They looked down to see the dirty weavers and butchers they'd mocked, raising those heavy spiked clubs with murderous intent. The sound of the battle changed fundamentally. It was no longer the thunder of hooves or the clash of noble combat. It was the wet, sickening, crunching sound of hardwood hitting steel. It was the sound of the goedendag doing exactly what it was designed to do. The French nobility had ridden directly into a mechanical meat grinder, and now the handle was being turned. In the mud of the graining stream, all the civilized rules of war were suspended. Usually in medieval combat, when a knight fell, the battle paused for a brief, ritualized transaction. The knight would raise his gauntleted hand and yield. He would announce his name and title. He would discuss his ransom potential. The captor would protect him carefully, seeing a walking bag of gold rather than an enemy to kill. It was a civilized business transaction. But the men of Ghent and Bruges were not businessmen conducting transactions today. They were executioners carrying out sentences. Before the battle, the Flemish commanders had issued a chilling order that violated every norm of Christendom and medieval custom. Take no prisoners whatsoever. Spare no one. Show no mercy. They knew that if they took captives, those same knights would eventually be ransomed, return with reinforcements, and burn their cities to the ground. To truly win, to secure actual freedom, they had to completely exterminate the class of people that threatened their existence. As the French knights struggled desperately in the bog, weighed down by 60 pounds of wet steel armor, they raised their hands in the traditional surrender gesture. They shouted their noble titles loudly. I am the Count of so-and-so. I can pay you 10,000 livres. I am worth a fortune." The response was a goedendag to the face, delivered without hesitation or mercy. The slaughter was systematic and methodical. The Flemish militia moved through the tangled mess of horses and men like experienced harvesters working a bloody field. They used the hooks of their weapons to drag knights violently from their saddles. They used the spikes to find the gaps in the armor, the vulnerable armpits, the exposed groin, the narrow visor. It was intimate, gruesome work, requiring close contact. A knight in full plate armor is extremely difficult to kill quickly, so the militia had to gang up on them. 3 or 4 guildsmen would surround a single fallen noble. One would pin his legs. Another would forcefully pry off his helmet. A third would finish the job with a blade or spike to the exposed face or throat. The churned mud turned deep red. The screams of dying men and horses merged into a single deafening cacophony. In the center of this boiling cauldron of violence was Robert of Artois himself, the commander of the French army. The man who had laughed at the rabbits and burned villages now found himself fighting desperately for every breath. His expensive warhorse had been killed under him. He was on foot, surrounded completely by the very people he had spent his life despising as subhuman. Historical accounts vary on his final moments, but the most telling and detailed version describes him cornered against the ditch, swinging his sword in desperate circles. He was a genuinely skilled warrior with decades of training, but individual skill means absolutely nothing when you are swarmed by 20 men with clubs. Robert reportedly cried out in desperation, "I surrender. I yield. I am the Count of Artois." He tried to offer his sword formally to a Flemish leader, expecting the automatic courtesy due his exalted rank. The Flemish soldier looked at him directly. He didn't see a count or a prince. He saw the man who had personally ordered his village burned. He saw the man who had promised to hang his children. There was no chivalric acceptance of the sword. There was no respectful bow. Robert of Artois was beaten to the ground by multiple clubs. They ripped the expensive armor from his body piece by piece. They stabbed him repeatedly, ensuring that the hero of France died in the same mud as the lowest conscript, indistinguishable. His body was left unrecognizable, just another heap of meat in the growing pile. This was the end of chivalry, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete guarantee of personal safety. For the first time in centuries, the nobility realized with horror that their titles were not magical force fields. The psychological shock of this moment cannot be overstated. It was like a modern army watching an entire tank battalion being dismantled by men with hammers. The massacre continued for hours without pause. The French rear guard, seeing the complete slaughter of their vanguard, panicked and fled the field entirely. The Flemish pursued them for miles, cutting down stragglers without mercy. By the time the sun began to set over the devastated battlefield, the flower of French nobility had been effectively decapitated. An eerie silence slowly returned to the fields of Courtrai, broken only by the groans of the dying and the splash of scavengers wading into the bloody water to strip corpses. The rabbits had not just survived against impossible odds, they had won completely. And now it was time to collect their symbolic receipts and send a message. The sun set on the 11th of July 1302, over a landscape that had been irrevocably altered by violence. The green fields were churned into a black slurry of mud, blood, and trampled grass. The groaning stream was literally choked with the damned corpses of the finest warhorses in Europe. But as the adrenaline slowly faded, the practical reality of the victory began to set in for the exhausted Flemish militia. They had not just defeated an army, they had financially bankrupted an entire social class. In the medieval world, remember, a knight was a walking treasury. His custom armor, his weapons, his trained horse, and his jewelry represented more wealth than a peasant village earned in a decade of labor. And now all that portable wealth was lying in the mud, waiting to be claimed. The looting began immediately and systematically. It wasn't just greed, it was pragmatic military necessity. The militia needed to strip the dead to absolutely ensure they were truly dead and couldn't rally, and to gather the resources needed for the inevitable French counterattack. But amidst the swords and the coin purses, the Flemish sought one specific trophy with symbolic meaning: the Golden Spurs. The spur was the ultimate status symbol of the equestrian class throughout Europe. You earned your spurs ceremonially when you were dubbed a knight. They represented your right to ride above common men. To strip a knight of his spurs was the ultimate act of class degradation. The Flemish didn't just take a few as souvenirs. They took them systematically by the basketful. They moved from corpse to corpse, unbuckling the gilded straps from the boots of counts, barons, and castellans. They found the spurs of Raoul de Nesle, the Constable of France. They found the spurs of Robert of Artois, now wiped clean of his noble blood. They found the spurs of Jacques de Châtillon, the hated governor who had started this entire war with his oppression. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were staggering. Historians debate the exact figure, but tradition holds that the Flemish collected 500 pairs of golden spurs. That represents 1,000 pieces of solid gold, stripped from the heels of the French elite. This was a demographic catastrophe for France. In a single afternoon, the kingdom lost its senior military command, its most experienced administrators, and the hereditary heads of its most powerful families. There were castles throughout Normandy and Burgundy that would sit empty for years, waiting for toddler heirs to come of age. The King's Council in Paris was practically dissolved because almost everyone on it was dead in a Flemish ditch. The Flemish took these bloody trophies and did something theatrical with deep symbolic meaning. They didn't immediately melt them down for coin. They marched to the church of Our Lady in Courtrai and hung them from the rafters. Imagine walking into that church in 1302. You look up, and shimmering in the candlelight are hundreds of golden spurs, clinking softly in the draught. It was a macabre wind chime, a monument to the impossible, a warning to future invaders. The Battle of the Golden Spurs proved that divine right offered no protection against sharp sticks and determined weavers. However, we must be careful not to romanticize the aftermath too much. This victory bought Flanders freedom, but only temporarily. Philip eventually raised another army, but the psychological spell was permanently broken. The battle proved that infantry could destroy mounted knights. The spurs hanging in the church were tombstones of an era. The age of the invincible knight was over. The age of the foot soldier had begun. History is about power shifts. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was tectonic. Something fundamental broke in the European psyche. For centuries, feudalism's social contract was based on a protection racket. Nobility held weapons, protected peasantry, extracted labor. The knight was the enforcer, the nuclear deterrent. The assumption was that commoners could not fight knights. Courtrai proved this was a lie. This signaled the infantry revolution. The Scots would replicate this at Bannockburn. The English would perfect it with longbows at Crécy and Agincourt. The Swiss would turn it into science. The Golden Spurs was the prototype, demonstrating that disciplined infantry with terrain and armor-piercing weapons could stop the most expensive military asset cold. The equation of war changed. Beyond tactics, there's a human lesson resonating across 7 centuries. The French lost because of hubris. Robert and Philip confused equipment superiority with character superiority. They looked at militia and saw rabbits because they couldn't conceive of weavers having courage equal to counts. They refused to adapt because they loved their self-image. This pattern repeats. We see it in falling empires, bankrupt corporations, superpowers in asymmetric conflicts. Whenever giants underestimate smaller opponents, the ghost of Courtrai watches from the mud. The physical spurs didn't hang forever. 80 years later, the French returned. Won a battle, took them back, but the psychological scar remained permanent. The Lion of Flanders still roars. July 11 is the official holiday of the Flemish community. It remains a potent symbol of identity, resistance, and underdog power. So, when you feel overwhelmed by forces that seem invincible systems, competitors, circumstances, remember the weavers of Bruges. Remember that the ground you stand on matters more than the armor you wear. Remember that even the heaviest cavalry can be stopped with enough friends, sharp sticks, and courage to hold the line. If this deep dive into medieval warfare fascinated you, subscribe to Maproom Battles. Hit that notification bell. We have massive libraries of forgotten history waiting. And here's a question for you. The Flemish executed French knights rather than ransoming them, breaking medieval rules to secure freedom. Do you view this as necessary survival or a war crime born of hatred? Discuss below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter of history.